Cohn, Professor of Social Justice and Social Policy and Associate Dean for Research and Policy Engagement at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. He is also a professor of social work and the inaugural director of Poverty Solutions, an interdisciplinary presidential initiative that partners with communities and policymakers to find new ways to prevent and alleviate poverty. He is the co-author of $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America, and the author of the recently released book, The Injustice of Place. May I introduce to you Luke Shaefer.
Thanks. I wanted to be a little bit closer to you all, so it's great to be with you. I am a U of M person, but I spent a number of lovely years here in the Lansing area. And so I'm a particular fan of the MSU Dairy Store. I don't know, that's definitely much better than anything we have in Ann Arbor. When my wife was at St. Paul's, Lansing, we were here, and so I worked on my dissertation from here. And I really like coming to churches because I get to talk more about what got me into this work. So it was our collective faith tradition and sort of my understanding of the gospel that led me to this work. Early on, I thought maybe I was called to the ministry. It turned out I was called to be a preacher's spouse, which is a very particular role, So sometimes life takes us in directions we didn't expect. But I do remember sort of this moment in high school just thinking, we were talking a lot about, as a church when I was in high school, about sexual orientation, money. I remember going to conventions and thinking, these are the things we spend a lot of time, and just comparing that to the gospel and thinking, goodness, it seems like Jesus spent an awful lot of time talking about poverty. Right? He spent an awful lot of time about caring for those who are most vulnerable. And so that's really what sort of drove me to say, I think that our work should be proportional to that, right? As a church, if we're really living into this, to Jesus's call, that's a lot of what we should be doing. And so I decided to try to be a part of that. And early on in my career, I started working in casework. So I was helping families who were experiencing, maybe an eviction, a crisis of maybe being evicted or having their utilities cut off. I spent a lot of time on the phone with landlords in the city, actually trying to get them to just, one more month, or if I pay this, can we stave this off? I think a couple of things. The first thing was also going back to my understanding of the gospel was this need to be in relationship. And so Jesus doesn't just say we should be caring about those with the least among us, but it seemed like he was saying we should really be connected to them. We should be in relationship. And so you couldn't sort of live it out, I think, even caring about poverty and not be, he's going to people's houses, right? It was that many of us would want to stay away from. But another thing that I didn't totally know what to do with at the time was this idea of what I call the structural cycle of poverty. So when you hear about cycle of poverty a lot, it's about, people are sort of thinking about family culture and not sort of maybe teaching sort of the ins and outs, and if we could just sort of train people better, they could survive. But as a caseworker, I spent every month, right, I could depend on some number of families not being able to pay their rent, some number of families not being able to pay their utilities. And so maybe there was a personal level thing, but it seemed awfully like this was a community level thing, right? Of the people were different, but the stories were the same every month, and it seemed more like a system. And so that's what led me to think if I really wanted to try to put a dent in this, that we had to look at a systems level. We had to look at like how policies are set up and what kind of circumstances that puts families in. So I ended up going to graduate school, and that's where I learned that I really love data. So a spreadsheet or a chart makes me feel really warm and cuddly inside, and I would cuddle up data at night, but Susie says no charts in the bed, I gotta leave that at the desk. So I ended up sort of doing this work in my office. I got a job at U of M, which was great to come home to where I grew up. And I think that was really, really good work. But it took me out of being in community in any way, right? I'd look at data about how some of our social welfare programs and our systems were working, and then I would get frustrated with my statistical model, and I'd go down and get a cup of coffee to cool off. And the biggest thing is when you're working like that, you don't know what you're missing, right? You don't know what the questions are that you don't even know how to ask. So in the book $2 a Day, that was me trying to marry these two things together. So I met up with Kathy Eden, and Kathy spent all of her career actually going out and talking to people. When she wanted to know about poverty in the United States, she would go out and talk to people. So we sort of tried to join forces and do both things. And it led to, I think, a period of my career that has been all about surprises, sort of going about the work and learning about all these things that I never would have known about before. So in $2 a Day, we were talking to really, really poor families. And I remember being in Chicago where we were looking at data. We could see this big increase in the number of families who had no money. So they might have food assistance, and they're able to get stuff from private charity, but they didn't have any dollars in their pocket. So the book was really about how do you manage that? Who are the families who experience this? And so I remember seeing a little scar on the inside crease of the elbow of one of the moms who was living, on less than $2 per person per day. So I saw this little divot, and I thought, oh, maybe that's a drug track line. She looks like she's clean now, but maybe there's some history of substance abuse. Because we all actually, with poverty, we all come pre-programmed with these things, even when you've studied it for a long time, right? These things get triggered because, whenever I say I study poverty at the cocktail party, people have thoughts, right? One way or the other. They come with thoughts, and so do I, right? They're sort of ingrained in us in a lot of ways. So as we talked to Jennifer Hernandez more and more, we learned actually this was a divot from selling her blood plasma so often. So in the United States, you can sell your blood plasma up to 2 times a week. We're the only country that allows you to do that. Every other country is deemed the health risk too high. Somebody like Jessica Compton, who we met, who was married to Travis. Travis had been working in a fast food, but his hours have been cut down to 0. Rachel and Blythe, I think, were 2 and 4. They're 2 kiddos. She would use some of her food assistance to buy an iron-rich bar because her iron levels had to be high enough. And she would check out a book from the library because if she read that, then she wouldn't get too nervous when she was going to go and sell their blood plasma. And twice a week, they would do the fairly long walk to the blood plasma center, and she would answer all the questions and then sit on the bed for however long it took, and 2 hours later they'd be back home with $30. And this was the only money coming into their home. And so we saw this over and over again. So we decided to go back and sort of look at the big data, and it turned out that there had been, at that point, this tripling in the number of people selling their blood plasma from about 1999. We were looking in 2015. Now we're at a quintupling. So it went from about 10 million plasma units sold in the United States to over 50 million plasma units sold in the most recent years. And it turns out the United States accounts for 70% of the world's plasma supply and only 40% of the demand. So we actually export the blood plasma of mostly poor Americans all over the world. So when the book came out and we wrote about Jessica Compton, it was excerpted in the Atlantic magazine, we got a fairly sternly worded letter from the Trade Association of Plasma Producers that it's fine for you to talk about poverty, but could you please mention that plasma is an important component in a lot of life-saving treatments. So plasma is an important component in a lot of life-saving treatments. It's true, actually. Like the blood plasma that poor Americans, mostly poor Americans, produce for all of the world saves people's lives. And interestingly, when the book came out, we also heard from other people who are like, you're going to help us make it so nobody can sell their blood plasma. And I was like, we are definitely not going to do that because number one, the life-saving thing, right? Number two, I know what the other alternatives are for people who don't have any money. Most of them are illegal and maybe even less safe. But I do think it is a really good conversation to have, how much should Jessica Compton be compensated for her blood plasma? Could we actually have some studies to find out if it is physically safe to sell your blood plasma twice in 1 week? And the biggest thing is that I had been called a national poverty expert in many newspapers at that point, and I had no idea that this was a central way of making ends meet until I went out and talked to people. And none of my colleagues did either. So when you do this sort of work in a vacuum, you really don't know. In the city of Detroit, Poverty Solutions, the shop that I run at U of M, we formed a partnership with Mayor Duggan and his team to try to enhance mobility in one of the nation's poorest cities, the nation's poorest city right now. Cleveland, we had just let Cleveland leapfrog us 2 years ago. That was an exciting moment, and now we're back. But to the poorest. Although poverty has really dropped in the city of Detroit over the last decade. There's been a huge amount of success, and a lot of that has been about increasing income of longtime residents. So there are some positive things going on. But as we went out and started talking to folks about what are the biggest barriers to escaping poverty, we heard sort of over and over, if I had made a list of all of the things that I thought we should try to tackle in the city of Detroit, one thing that would have not been in my top 100 was the cost of auto insurance. But we heard it over and over again, so we did some research, and the same thing, the same policy that costs something like $1,000 nationally a year and was pricing out at about $6,000 in the city of Detroit. That's about 20% of the typical Detroiter's annual income. Can you imagine spending 20% of your annual income on auto insurance? So, of course, this is not it. There was no person sort of running the show saying Detroiters should spend all of this money on auto insurance. It was just this confluence of events where in the 1970s we went down a road on auto. That was a funny pun. We went down a road on auto insurance that no other state in the nation went down, and ended up with some really great. If you got into an auto accident and you have major health challenges, you get a better deal in Michigan than anywhere else. It also created a system that was really, really good for healthcare systems. So when we started talking about auto insurance as an issue related to mobility and poverty in the United States, in Detroit and the rest of the state, we heard from many healthcare systems that were if we were to change this, it could just bankrupt our whole health system, or we would be out hundreds of millions of dollars. So I'm not going to get into the details there, but I'm going to sort of make 2 points. One is, think of like the single mom in the city of Detroit who's trying to work in a job. Because of the way the whole region is structured, oftentimes that job's in the suburb, and there's no public transportation at all, so she's driving back and forth, and she has this choice to make one morning of whether or not she's going to drive. Her insurance expired. She doesn't quite have whatever fraction of the $6,000 that she needs to pay it, and she's got to decide, do I go to the job, and drive uninsured, or do I not go to the job and possibly lose the job? So she decides to go. She gets pulled over maybe for like an out tail light, and then she gets a ticket. Because as a state, we have been very reluctant to sort of raise taxes for a very long time. One thing that we have done is raise the price of those tickets. So the ticket is a pretty big ticket, and then when she doesn't pay the ticket, she can actually get a ticket on top of the ticket. And so, and if she doesn't pay that, which sometimes like get into $1,000 or so, she can have her license suspended. And then what is going to happen? Then she's definitely going to lose the job. So this is that structural cycle of poverty, right? This is a cycle of poverty that I think sort of ripples through not just a family, but across a system. And in both of these two cases, right, imagine plasma and imagine auto insurance, it's not just the problem of a family, right? This is a system where the decisions you make are going to impact the patients, right, that are getting plasma, and they're going to impact healthcare systems, and they're going to impact people with good auto insurance benefits. So this is what gets us into sort of the challenges of making systems work better, and also thinking of, I think we can also think about, to the extent to which we've had really, really great auto insurance healthcare benefits, it has been built on, the premiums of Detroiters to some extent, right? They are paying the most of any of us. So the new book that I have, The Injustice of Place, it tries to really think about what it means to think about things like poverty as like community level issues to be solved. And how do we think of the role that we play when we are in relationship, whether we think we are or not, with folks who are higher up the economic ladder than us, or much lower down the economic ladder than us. And again, this book was a book of tons and tons of surprises. I'm just going to mention sort of two insights, and then I'm going to stop and would love to just take the conversation wherever you all would like to go. We were in Clay County in eastern Kentucky. Manchester is the county seat, and they're still very much in the throes, very much being ravaged by the opioid crisis there. I think as a nation, we feel like we've made a lot of progress on the opioid crisis, but actually we have more people dying of opioid overdose in the last couple of years than we ever had before. Some of it's more like flipping, away from prescriptions to illegal drugs. But in Kentucky, which was actually like targeted for sort of the start of the opioid epidemic, the effect is the same, right? And so we really, people were bringing it up, they were talking about it, and we were asking folks what can be done about it. And they, over and over again, we heard from people, kids get into drugs because there's nothing else to do. There's nothing to do but drugs. And as like serious scholars, who always have complicated, like big picture solutions to stuff, we kind of didn't take that seriously. But when you hear it over and over and over again, like there's nothing to do but drugs. If you're doing your work honestly, you gotta like take it seriously, right? So we started to look at it, and it turns out there's like tons and tons of really interesting research that kind of backs this up, right? So what does it mean to have something to do? It usually means you have something to do together with other people, right? You have cheap fun is usually what we're talking about. So arcades. Turns out like arcades are pretty good places to go where people go and like connect, and like they get the endorphins of having like been in a space with people. Parks, I bet some of you as new parents made friends like while you're sitting, pushing kids on the swing set. I know I did. Bowling alleys, some of you may remember, like we got one big bowler here. Robert Putnam's famous book, Bowling Alone, about the decline of that, right? And we're trying to add to that to say, like, it's not just that people are bowling alone, it's that there's no bowling alley to go to anymore. So, like, think of all the things these types of places do for us. They can be leveling, right? If you, everyone can bowl, right? It's cheap fun that sort of can bring us together across differences. And there's all this great research out there that shows like bringing people together across differences to form these connections can help with economic opportunity. It can help with community cohesion. So it also turns out, like, as these places start to disappear, research shows that opioid deaths go up. And like declines in the number of civic organizations can also means that's a lot of bells. Do they ever stop? Right. All right, here's one of my favorite studies about rats in laboratories. So hopefully nobody gets offended I'm comparing us all to rats, but just there are these studies that show if you have like a little solitary rat in a solitary cage and you give him access to drugs, he is probably going to get addicted, he's probably going to overdose, and he very well may die. But if the solitary rat actually has little rat friends and they have fun things to do in the cage, they will use the drugs a little bit, but they mostly won't get addicted, and none of them will die. And then there's this interesting story about Vietnam. So it turns out American soldiers stationed in Vietnam used drugs in like mass quantities. One reason was they were cheap, but the other was like a lot of them were just bored out of their minds. There was nothing to do. And it turns out Nixon got really upset about this. He didn't like this. You're shocked, I know. And so he commissioned this study. It turned out like when folks came back home into well-structured lives and their social support, that drug use just like plummeted in ways that actually a lot of our models would suggest was impossible based on what we knew about sort of the levels of addiction in the group. So a lot of times sort of the answers are very complicated and we don't know what to do. But in this case, it's actually maybe more simple than I would have thought. Like, this isn't going to be the silver bullet. It's not going to take care of like all like drug addiction or all of our problems. But what if building social infrastructure, sort of building these places where we can come together and have fun together and like get that social connection and have the sort of, endorphins go off in our brains because we had a great conversation with somebody. We got to meet someone who we wouldn't have otherwise. What if that really can sort of buffer us against these other things? And it also like turns out that people will really like it. It feels to me like it's pretty well into like the type of thing that I think Jesus would want us to do, right? Of like bringing people together to form connections and care for each other and maybe have some fun. So the the only other example from the book, and we have lots of chapters about what we think are the mechanisms that sort of lead to perpetuated poverty. So one is like the lack of social infrastructure. People end up sequestered in their homes. They're not connected. They lose out on the benefits of that. Another is another one I had no plans to write about before we got into the book is government corruption. So, we were in the Mississippi Delta in Greenwood, Mississippi, LaFleur County. And over the time that we were getting to know that, this welfare scandal breaks, which you may have heard of in the news, implicating Super Bowl winning quarterback Brett Favre. So Favre took $1.1 million to give speeches that there's no record anywhere that he actually made. He's given the money back now after he had said everything was fine, how could anyone accuse him of anything? And then he had some text messages that came out that were asked, could anyone find out where the money came from? So that's never a good sign, right? This was money from the state's welfare program. This was money that was supposed to go to cash aid to families to buy diapers or toothbrushes or pay the rent. But the 1.1 million is just like chump change compared to the overall scandal, which now looks to be over $80 million in these funds that came in through a nonprofit organization that was charged with doing the public good, and then was used to enrich the leaders of the nonprofit organization, to fund schools that didn't really exist, to pay celebrities to do speeches that they didn't really give, or to provide programs. So that's sort of very clearly taking money out of the pockets of poor families with children. And let me tell you, there's a lot of poor families in Mississippi, right? In every other community, there was a similar, although less sort of sensational story. In Crystal City in South Texas, in 2016, this is a town of 3,000 people. The FBI descends on City Hall and arrests every member of the city council and the mayor and the city manager for racketeering, bribery schemes, all sorts of stuff. And then one of the things I think is most interesting is they take all of the records of what the city had been doing, right? All of the contracts, everything, so that the next mayor who comes in to take office, who is this military veteran who actually come back after a successful career to try to give back to his community. There's no record of what had been happening in the town that whole time. So you're not taking money directly out of the many, the pockets of poor families, but you have a city municipal government that is supposed to be looking out for the city, trying to bring jobs, and so if you're spending your time enriching yourself, you can't be sort of looking out for your constituents. And every single community had an example like this. And I think if we had sort of no connection to history, we could use that kind of thing to discount or sort of let ourselves off the hook, right? Of saying these communities are, there's nothing to be done because they can't help themselves. But if you look back in history, there's this long arc. This sort of stuff didn't appear out of nowhere. It goes back 100 years or 200 years, and it's usually a function of a small number of people who are in control of the town, taking the spoils and sort of leaving nothing for the large number of people who really need the help. So I think that's a little trickier for me to figure out how it fits into Christianity. There's maybe we can talk about that a little bit. But the thing that I find like most interesting is in every one of these very poor communities, when I would talk to community leaders, like if you go to any poor community and say, what really needs to change to make your community do better, I bet you will hear something about how the poor don't work hard enough, or they're not behaving like they should, they don't have the right values. And I bet you will hear nothing about the corruption of the folks who are running the town today or a decade ago or a couple decades ago. As a nation, we do almost nothing, I think. You know, like the case of the FBI coming in is relatively infrequent, right? We only know about the ones that we know about. You know, one of the best antidotes to this are local journalism, which is sort of a dying thing. But in each case, except for Crystal City, but you know, take the Mississippi welfare scandal, it gets broken by this wonderful newspaper, Mississippi Today in Mississippi, and a reporter, Anna Wolf, who ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize because she just was like a dog with a bone, and she wouldn't let it go until like she uncovered this massive, biggest, you know, in state history welfare scandal. So I think it all sort of leads to an approach, right, of trying to understand that the challenges of poverty and inequality can't be problematized onto sort of one segment of society, but if we understand them more deeply as systems, it does lead to the possibility of systems change and new ways of going about the work. And I'll just end with, I think, I'm just gonna end there, and because I want to be able to take the conversation wherever you want to go. But I will also say that like when we take that kind of approach, change is possible, and that we are able to both uncover something like the Mississippi welfare scandal and figure out things that we should be doing that can have both an evidence base behind them and also an ethic, right, of understanding about being in relationship and trying to look out for those who have the least. Yeah, Jan.
So I'm curious about the response to these, to poverty, whether you find it's better at the local level or the national level, and I think particularly about the child tax credit that singularly pulled many, you know, I don't know what the statistics were, but pulled people out of poverty, and then it was not continued.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, my first book, $2 a Day, played a role with the expanded child tax credit. So it was a book that caught a fair amount of attention among policymakers. And my colleagues and I, so Kathy and I and 8 others, we really started to think about how do you help families with cash better? Because the old welfare system we had, like nobody liked it. Not even folks who were getting it, really. It was deeply stigmatized. And so how do we do it differently? Well, it turns out like countries all over the world have a model. And it's very different. It starts from a very different set of values. That is, raising kids is expensive, and society has a reason to come alongside families in that work. And so we're gonna, for not just the very poor kids and not just the middle class kids, but we're gonna have one policy that says every family gets a small amount of money every month, maybe $250 per kid, $300 per young kid, and to help with diapers or childcare or whatever it is. So that was the logic behind the expanded child tax credit, which, as Janet mentions, we did for 1 year, really 6 months in 2021. And what happened in 2021? Like child poverty plummeted to the lowest level ever. There's about between 3 and 4 million kids lifted out of poverty, depending on how you're doing the count, like a lot of kids. But also, interestingly, food hardship plummets to the lowest level during 2021. The number of families reporting they were doing okay financially was at an all-time high at the end of 2021. And one of my favorite ones was that the number of Americans with bad credit actually fell to the lowest level ever in 2021. It really was a shocking period of time, I have to tell you. I don't think we did everything right with our safety net response during COVID, but at the end of 2021, Americans were actually in some of the best financial shape, maybe the best financial shape they had ever been. And that child tax credit seems to have been sort of the most successful. The nice thing about the child tax credit was like it's a modest amount of money every month, so it's actually designed not to impact inflation compared to things like the economic impact payments that were huge chunks of money all at once. But they all played a role, and it was done by divided government. The child tax credit wasn't, although it had Republican support, but some of the other safety net stuff we did was a Democratic Congress, Democratic House, and Republican Senate and Republican President. So, I think we think there's like no possibility that anything can ever get done, but actually this is an example where government acted, right? A set of policymakers that we think couldn't possibly get along, and I think they did a lot of good, and somehow we missed it, right? Because as a country, we're sort of so focused on all of the bad stuff. But it's all been turned back at this point. Like, we didn't sort of say, okay, we could modify this to keep it going in the future, or we could do this or that. We're sort of like, we decided we're done with that, and now, the most recent numbers, child poverty just went right back up, right? More than a doubling. All those kids sort of back in poverty, and a lot of the positive outcomes are starting to dwindle down. So where does that leave us? I actually do still remain hopeful because we proved what could be done, and we proved it was possible. And I don't think anything's happening now at the federal level. So I wouldn't count on anything good or happening anytime soon. But to get to your point, I really take a both and type approach. I really believe there is something at the local level, maybe in the city of Lansing, maybe at the county. I do a lot of work in the city of Detroit, and there's a lot that can be done at the state level. Each one of these levels, it's possible to find something every day that can make systems work better or worse for our most vulnerable families. Whether it's transportation routes, right, and who can get where, whether it's housing production, right? We're still we're still building rehab, 1 million fewer houses a year than we did a decade ago. And I think you're seeing prices rise as a result. So to me, the goal is not so much that it be at one level, that all has to happen at the federal level, as so much as I encourage people to sort of look at the systems, right? And not just be trying to change the individuals, but think how can we make the systems that people are embedded in, the healthcare system, education, how can we change those so that they work better for people? Yeah. Oh, we had a hand there, and then.
I know that in the city of Detroit, there's a small housing community where a lot of they've provided housing and access to services, including training people to, assume various positions.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that when you have that kind of community to rely on, that things can sort of work themselves out, and they get the health services they need, they get the mentoring services they need, and they have housing. And I don't know why that can't be translated into other cities across the community and the U.S.
Yeah, such a great question. So I'll just give you sort of my take on it. I think one of the things that makes this sort of arrangement most effective is like the autonomy and the empowerment, right? As you said, a lot of times when we do things, it's sort of, we're doing them for people. Maybe they can't be trusted. Maybe we think they don't, have the ability to make decisions themselves. And not just in developments like you're thinking of, but also like homelessness encampments actually often like form these like self-governed structures. And people really, like, it matters to them, right? It actually, I think we think of like Maslow's hierarchies, that you have to feed people first and then provide housing, and then like they can start to like do things for themselves. But people are like, they want to have some say in their lives, and we often take that away. So I think if there are ways to, sometimes I think we do that in the church, right? If we have like a feeding program where basically I'm just a consumer coming in, like, are there ways to give people more power and control or autonomy? Like, and there's really interesting research that backs up that can have its own positive effects, not just make people feel better. There's a great new paper out that looks historically. So after the Civil War, there were this incredible number of like highly effective Black members of Congress and other policymakers that took office and did a lot of really good things. And eventually Jim Crow like cuts that all down, right? But for a period, we had this set of people. And so the paper said, like, how did that come to be? Did it just spring up out of nowhere? Well, it turns out, like, as like Sherman's coming down, other folks, I think Grant's coming down too, like on the west, the western front of the Civil War. All of these folks who are enslaved sort of present themselves to the Union Army, right? They run away, and so the Union Army doesn't want to give them back, but at this point in time, they're still property, right? They can't sort of set them free to the north. So they form these, they basically call them contraband of war, which of course is totally offensive. But it allows them to create these camps that become these like self-governed camps of former slaves, or technically current slaves, who are given technical support from the Union Army, but basically run the camps and organize them themselves. And they form these like networks of other camp leaders, and they learn from each other. And a disproportionate number of the people who become, these national members of Congress and statespeople actually came up through the track of leadership through these camps. So by providing these opportunities to like practice the art of leadership, we can, like, people learn from that, just like they learn from working on their handwriting or whatever else. And so I think it's a really interesting model, and I think we need to do more with these like municipal governments too, in very small towns, of like helping provide the technical support so that they have the skills to do the job that I think most of them want to do well. But this like power, autonomy, sort of the opportunity to have a say over my life is often missing in the way that we go about our services. And when we provide that, when we provide choice, when we sort of incorporate people into the model, we can have better results.
I was just wondering kind of your thoughts about universal basic income. Oh, sorry. I normally have a loud voice. I'm the one who likes bowling.
Yes, I remember, yeah.
Yes. So universal basic income, right? But you also mentioned a value system several times, right? And a value system in America versus a value system in other countries. And I kind of think of like an individualistic perspective of people who may be considered more wealthy, kind of not wanting to vote against their own self-interest, but that people who may be experiencing lower socioeconomic status, voting against their own self-interest, and how that is actually at a community level and a systems, like you mentioned several times, a systems level of how does that, to me, that's like a cognitive dissonance. And I was just wondering some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I am very much a child allowance, child benefit proponent. This is a set of policies that have been tried over and over and over again. In every other country that does the same thing I talked about with the expanded child tax credit, which is like tons of countries, sees child poverty plummet and kids do better. With something like a guaranteed basic income, I'm interested, but I don't know what it should look like. Like I worry about the inflationary pressures when you're talking about more money. So I believe in the idea that often giving people money is a better way to help them than a lot of what we do. But I don't know what it should look like, if that should be like everybody. The numbers get really big very quickly. So I think this is a great time to do some experimentation with that. I was mentioning before, Emily, who's here, is working on a pilot we have going in Ann Arbor that is working with folks who are sort of underrepresented folks or low-income folks who like want to start a business or have sort of a side gig and they want to try to invest in that. And they're going to be getting a small basic income for the next couple of years. I think that's really, really interesting. The thing that worries me is I do, like going back to $2 a day, when we would ask families, like if we came back and you were doing well, what did it look like? They all said I would have a job with stable hours usually, in a place of my own. And so the thing that I do continue to like not know how to get around with UBI is like, how does it fit that need for people to contribute? How does it, if it's a UBI that just like says, all right, you get the money and now go away, I want to do my own thing now. I'm not sure it quite gets us to all of this other vision that I'm talking about, that I've been talking about today. So, there are different ways to like increase the number of jobs, and I think those are interesting things to think about. Maybe it can be done in combination. It does turn out when we're talking about like creating jobs for people that's really expensive. It's not very efficient, basically. So are there ways that we can be thinking about like helping people make meaning of their life and having the ability to like make a contribution to the world, which is often very difficult when you don't have a lot of money. And are there ways with UBI where we can like surgically do it with certain groups? And maybe the evidence will continue to build and it'll be something that will, a broader set of people will be on board with. So that's where I'm somewhere in the middle, I think, on these things, basically.
I really appreciate your Lansing connection, and I realize you're a national expert. Just wondered if you've drilled down the data to our community. In today's prayer, there's a prayer that the east side of 127, the west side of 127 would look more like the east side of 127. I think that's kind of a simplistic division. But I just wonder if you have any drilled down data for our local area, which is interesting because we have small towns.
Yeah.
We have Leslie, we have areas where there's poverty, maybe invisible poverty, and then we have this more ethereal East Lansing, Okemos area, and I would dare to say that it's been years, but I had a dear friend here at church that once I wanted to take her downtown to Washington Square. I was talking about something down there, and she's like, well, why would I ever go down there? I just wondered, from your research, have you looked at our area? Obviously, you're devoted to Detroit.
Yeah, I haven't looked at numbers of, the community, but it does follow a very Michigan pattern, right? So our most successful industries right now are education and also healthcare, obviously. So the places where those two things are clustered are doing quite well. Healthcare is we spend a lot on healthcare, and I think it's maybe a little bit of a long-term sort of ticking time bomb in terms of like how long this thing we have going can continue. Education, it's an interesting thing. Like MSU and Michigan have been fairly robust. We have population decline, which is another systems thing, right? There are just fewer people coming up, so it's going to be a very difficult time for most colleges and universities in Michigan for a period of time, just because there's fewer kids. Michigan, like you described, sort of the central Michigan region here we have rural poverty, and my most recent book is mostly about rural poverty, and I do think like there's not like the infrastructure of social services, there's not the healthcare infrastructure, the jobs are, in our urban centers, like public transportation doesn't work well. In poor rural areas, there's no public transportation at all, right? So there are pros and cons, but that's, we don't serve folks in these rural areas who are poor very well. And then, we have the long-term consequences of deindustrialization. I guess that's one thing I meant to mention in an earlier question. I actually think I came away from I used to be sort of a free trade is better for everyone in the long run, and we should compensate the losers. And in this book, really, I'm feeling much more muddled on that, because I've spent a lot of time with like the losers of free trade, and as we've lost, first in Michigan, but also like these southern pockets that I was in, as more and more of our manufacturing has gone to other countries, it's had massive economic consequences for these places. And I guess I don't know the history of Lansing as well, but I think there was more industrial base. Maybe somebody, yeah, all right. And that, it drew up a lot of people from other places to bring those jobs, and then that whole economy crashed. And we've had a lot of our eggs in one basket for a long time, and so there's a consequence of that. I think actually the political ramifications of that are much greater. Like a lot of the southern areas that, there's no new research that suggests like when like manufacturing jobs are shipped away from a country, it pushes people in a nationalist type direction, and it sort of leads to a certain set of politics that we wouldn't have necessarily called, Democrat or Republican years ago, but it's taken up a certain set, and I think has played a role in the election of Donald Trump in 2016. So I think we haven't appreciated how much sort of these massive economic changes have impacted our politics. And I think a place like the Lansing metro area you've got like all of it, all of these themes sort of playing themselves out. There are going to be like huge differences in life expectancy, right? I imagine that there are census tracts where you have life expectancies that are 10 or 15 years different across this area. We got Charlie. Maybe we'll do 2 or 3 more? Or do you need to turn us off? I can't say no to Charlie because he's an old friend. And then if I don't, then we had 2 others, yeah.
This summer, I was involved with the Capital Region Community Foundation. We built an all-inclusive play structure down.
Cool, great. Social infrastructure.
Yeah, it was very cool.
Yeah.
But in that process, I learned that this summer, the city of Lansing experienced a huge increase in the number of homeless folks.
Yeah.
And they all seem to congregate downtown along Michigan Avenue, along in the Riverfront Park.
Yeah.
And the city officials were very, very frustrated because talking with, Volunteers of America, the Salvation
Yeah.
Army, and these other groups,
Yeah.
they were saying, hey, we got all kinds of capacity. Nobody's coming in for meals. Nobody's, I shouldn't say
Interesting.
nobody, but, the number of people that could be coming in were not. And when I would, working on the place, anyway, structure, I was down there talking to a lot of these folks. What the common theme I heard was, well, we don't like going to Volunteers of America because they got too many rules, or we don't like going to the Salvation
Right.
Army because they got too
Yeah.
many rules. I got to be in there by 10. It's lights out by 11. I got to
Yeah.
get up at 6. I got to take a shower. I got to shave.
Yeah.
I got to do all this. I don't want to do that stuff.
Yeah.
So I can understand they have to have rules. They have to maintain order and so forth. But
Right.
these folks don't like those rules
Yeah.
until it gets really cold.
Yeah.
And then they say, okay, I'll put up with some rules for a warm
They
bed.
don't freeze. Yeah.
But it creates havoc for the city because they don't like these people, sleeping in the parks, and the business people don't like the problems that brings and so forth. So there's a real fine line there of, too many rules, not enough rules, and so forth. And it's neither side is willing to give.
Yeah, no, I think this is, in a broader structure, it does look to me from the data that some of this is a result of us disinvesting in housing over time. Like, less housing for everybody else puts pressure down the line, right, of who's getting what's available. But that doesn't solve the immediate thing. But I do think it's not just that I don't like putting up with the rules, but I do think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier of folks who I don't like having rules imposed upon me. I don't like going in and having no say. And I think it's worth it to spend a little time thinking about what does a person feel like when they go in the door to these places? So I would encourage the service providers to think about what rules do they need? There are some rules they need. I think this is a good time across the board where maybe we think do we need to do it this way? Do we need to have people out the door by that? Can we give them a little bit more places of freedom and choice? And sometimes the answer is no, but a lot of times the answer is yes. With employers who say they can't find work, I do encourage them to think okay, what barriers are you putting up to people? Drug tests, do you need it? If you do, keep it, but could you try without it and see what happens? Does all hell break loose? Do you get really bad folks, or maybe it actually works out okay? And so encouraging the providers, and they might say, oh, professor, they don't live in the real world. I don't know, but I think it's worth nudging them to say, do you really need all these rules? Or is there a way for the residents to make their own rules? Sometimes they can be more stringent. And then I do think wondering, can we actually sanction a homelessness encampment where there could be a self-governing structure? In Ann Arbor, we had one for a while, and finally they closed it down. I think the worry is it become a terrible place, or people will get hurt. But if you had a set of people that really like that, can we make it so that they can have a self-governing structure that is not right where we want to be having businesses and kids playing at the beautiful new structure? So I'm not saying that all of these, this is easy in any way, but those are some of the ideas. I think it's worth trying to get everyone together and say, has anyone had a conversation, in a community way with folks who are homeless and stuff, what rules are you willing to put up with, right? Or how could it be changed so that you would want to go in? Or how could we make it better? I think we generally just assume they should be grateful for whatever, it is, and then are a little shocked when they don't take it. And the providers, could you change things and see where we can get? But I know this isn't easy.
Final question.
I think you may have just answered my question.
Oh.
I'm interested in the voices of the people who need help, and how you gather data. Do they trust us being those of us who are not impoverished and in need? And how do we make sure that their voices really are heard? and that they have confidence that it's their voices that are heard, not
Yeah.
the powers that be imposing something on them.
Yeah. Yeah, so a couple of different thoughts on this. The first is, if you ask respectfully, people really do like talking about themselves. Usually people like talking about themselves. And so if you can go in and like ask people to like tell their story, you have to appear to actually care, right? You have to care, I should say, right? Not just appear, but you have to be clear to them you care. But usually people will open up, and sometimes it can actually be very therapeutic for them in ways. We did a really interesting study. It was replicating an existing study where at a food pantry, we had a set of people who just went into a room and we said, tell us the story of something that you've done in your life that you were proud of. And I remember one guy came out and he's like crying, like, what's going on? Like, this was not a hard thing. You know, this was not like, I'm not asking you to remember some trauma or something. And he said, nobody had ever asked me that question before, like what I was proud of. And then in the study, it actually turns out people who are asked that question do better at like cognitive tests and stuff, like things that are supposed to be fairly stationary, they do better at. It turns out doing this with University of Michigan students has no impact at all. They've all been taught to think pretty highly of themselves, you know. So, like, what are the subtle messages that we're sending to people by whatever the rules are? Like, and you know, some of it has reasons why we did that, but like, you know, I like to say if there's like a single mom who wants to hear about everything she's doing wrong for her kids and for her life, like, she has infinite opportunities. So can we change that a little bit and actually ask folks, like in a respectful way, like actually care, right, and want to hear it, and then we can learn things, right? I happen to think that like me focusing on auto insurance, which was a part of this bill that we got in 2019, which was far from perfect, but has brought rates down by $1,000 per Detroiter. So that's not nothing, right? It was a better use of my time than a lot of the things I would have gone to had I not spent a lot of time talking to the families. The other thing I will mention is not to assume that when you talk to like community leaders or even nonprofit leaders, many of whom are wonderful and I have the deepest admiration for, but they often don't actually speak for clients. So it is worthwhile, like if you're getting into it, and I hope I sort of communicated, like I think there's lots of different pathways then. If you want to build social infrastructure where people can match, like you can do that. If you want to ferret out local corruption, like use the evidence base, but then like we can do things that matter if we focus, you know, if we start with listening and use evidence. So a lot of times community leaders, I think, have their own vantage point. That can be important, but it's not necessarily community residents. So, you know, I'll just give the example of one community I was in where we could see in the survey data we had done, representative survey, not just the people who show up, right? They look different or that violence was a really big issue in the community. And we talked to some community leaders and they were like, violence isn't an issue, it's just made up by the media. You know, they're using it to discredit us and everything. And I think they said that because violence was being used in the media to discredit the community, you know. But it didn't actually mean that violence wasn't a massive issue in the community. So that's the key. And like, that was something that needs to be addressed. And I don't know what it looks like in Lansing, but we've had this, after years of decline in violence, we've had this big upsurge in the last couple of years post-COVID, like something really brought out like the impulse challenges that are related to, and also there are tons of guns everywhere, right? Just huge numbers of guns, and that just makes things more violent. Like, so it's that milieu, but you can't, you know, just getting different perspectives, like, you know, sometimes you'll talk to like homeless individual after homeless individual, you'll see sort of the themes that emerge, and then that can tell you what to do. Just talking to the head of the Shelter Association. That'll give you other information, but you have to do a little bit more and just make sure you're getting info at different levels. Maybe that's a good one. Thank you so much.
Do you want to draw them in? Okay. I'll announce it. First book.
I told you everybody's the same.
Equal opportunity is what I'm hearing right now.
Somebody made a dart. Smooth that one.
First book. Gretchen. I know after it's yours. Chris. Mary Beth. Judith. June. Joe. Charlie. Charlie.
One of those two goes back.
They already have one for their house, is what they said.
One per household.
Emily. Emily Lynch, sorry. I forget there's multiple Emilys in here. Eleanor. Emily. Last one. Oh, okay. Sarah. I think there's only one Sarah in here, correct? All right. Well, thank you so much, Luke. Thank you all.